America in the World, 1898 to 2014. 1898, the Spanish-American War was fought between U.S. and Spain over the Cuban independence. After the sinking of the USS Maine, the U.S. entered war. Later that year, the Treaty of Paris was signed, which gave the U.S. temporary control over Cuba and seceded the colonial control of Puerto Rico, Guam, Philippines from Spain, which collapsed the Spanish Empire. In 1899, the open door policy occurred, when the American government called on other countries to keep Chinese markets from exploiting the other businesses through taxes. By not interfering in any treaty, these countries were able to have not one sole control over China, but multiple. The 1990 Boxer Rebellion occurred when the Militia United in Righteousness took over Beijing and captured foreigners and Christians. The 8-nation alliances, including the U.S., sent 20,000 armed troops and took back Beijing. In 1902, after the end of the Spanish-American War, the Philippines struggled for independence after the U.S. occupied it. The U.S. had changed the cultural landscape with 34,000 to 220,000 casualties, mostly from disease and starvation, but also the disablement of Roman Catholic religion and the introduction of English. In 1904, the Roosevelt Corollary states that the U.S. will intervene in conflicts between European countries and Latin American countries to enforce the legitimate claims of European powers rather than European powers pressing their claims directly. Roosevelt justified this by keeping with the Monroe Document and exercising international police power. In 1908, Ford Model T was the first global car being produced in U.S., Canada, and England. Then it expanded shortly after, which became the first affordable automobile. In the 1909 dollar diplomacy, President Taft pushed U.S. bankers and industrialists to move abroad. Through use of economic power, the U.S. wanted to guarantee loans needed to foreign countries like Latin America and East Asia. This led to Latin American disapproval of U.S. powers opening foreign markets and having financial leverage. In 1915, the RMS Lusitania was sunk by a German torpedo. The German embassy warned passengers of the war zone in Great Britain, but this started the U.S. and UK's involvement in World War I. World War I, the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 was signed between Germany and the Allied powers. This meant German disarmament, territorial concessions, and they would pay reparations. In 1937, the Neutrality Acts were a response to the growing tensions in Europe and Asia. The U.S. stated that they would not intervene due to costly involvement in World War I and no foreign entanglements. They limited their aid to Britain and France. 1941 surprise Japanese attack on the U.S. naval base Pearl Harbor led to the U.S. entering in World War II. The U.S. declared war on Japan, and the U.S. declared war on Germany after Italy and Germany both declared war on it. In 1945, the UN was created to promote international cooperation to prevent another world war. They promoted world peace, security, and protecting of the environment. The U.S. atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 ended World War II. That was the first and only use of the atomic weapon, which led to 90,000 to 166,000 casualties. In 1947, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade regulated international trade, reduced tariffs, and other trade barriers. The 1948 Marshall Plan, or the European Recovery Program, was the Americans' initiative to aid Europe. The U.S. gave economic support after World War II to prevent the spread of the USSR communism. In 1947, the Cold War started. It was a state of political and military tensions between the U.S. and the USSR. There was no large-scale direct fighting between the two sides, but it was nuclear warfare. This created the NATO. In 1949, any country subject to an armed attack, the members of NATO would come to aid. In 1956, the Vietnam War began. North Vietnam and their allies, China and the Soviet Union, was against South Korea and the U.S. The U.S. was trying to prevent the communist takeover. In 1973, the Paris Peace Accords established peace in Vietnam and an end to the Vietnam War. This ended direct military involvement for the U.S. and stopped the fighting temporarily. In 1961, Kennedy Peace Corps sent out volunteers on missions to countries outside of America to educate others on American culture and to understand those countries' cultures. This has now affected 139 cultures. 1962 Missile Crisis, a negotiation for the U.S. to take out missiles and warheads from Italy and Turkey. In return, the USSR would take missiles from Cuba, as long as the U.S. never invaded Cuba. 1973 Oil Crisis was an embargo against the U.S. from the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries because they were for Egypt and Syria's side in the Yom Kippur War. In 1975, North Vietnam took over Saigon, and over 1 million refugees came to the U.S. from South Vietnam. 1983 Operation Urgent Fury was when the U.S. deployed 1,900 military personnel to invade Grenada. The U.S. and the Caribbean Army was versus the Grenadan. The U.S. violated many international treaties and laws. In 1990, the Gulf War occurred when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and the U.S. and 34 other nations responded. This was the biggest coalition of countries since World War II. 1994 NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, between Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. eliminated trade and investment barriers. This had little export tariffs between the U.S. and Mexico. In 2001, 9/11 occurred when the terrorists attacked on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Al-Qaeda terrorist aggression was due to the U.S. involvement against Iraq. This resulted in 3,000 deaths. In the 2001 Afghanistan War, NATO and allies' intervention and ongoing war against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. The military loss was 15,000 and the civilian loss was 17,000. In the Iraqi invasion of 2003, the U.S., UK, Australia, Poland, and Spain invaded Iraq to dispose of Saddam Hussein and his terrorist government. In 2011, the withdrawal of the U.S. troops from Iraq was due to the U.S.-Iraq Status of Forces Agreement. In the 2008 global financial crisis, the stock market fell, which led to the bailout of banks by national government and the house market decreasing.